we just have a few announcements of some upcoming events we want to let you know about, and we're excited about those. And one of the biggest ones we're excited about is actually we have a confirmed Midwest Enneagram Conference in July, the 24th and 25th of next year. So write that down on your calendar, go back to the newsletter that we sent out and read that. We're going to be co-hosting that with the the Minnesota chapter, and it's titled Enneagram is a Verb. And we'll have a couple of amazing keynote speakers with Jerry Wagner and Chris Hewerts coming in, and breakout workshops, and we'll have all kinds more information coming out. Just mark the dates right now for July the 24th and 25th. A couple of trainings that are coming up. Our mentor, Dr. Jerry Wagner, will be hosting one in Chicago, Enneagram Spectrum training on September 7th and 10th. Clare and Scott have a couple of things coming up in their location in beautiful Michigan, Marshall, Michigan. If you haven't been there, they have one in September 12th and 13th, I think it is, on Enneagram and prayer that they'll be doing. And then the amazing training that Clare and Scott do with the Enneagram Motions of the Soul. She's added an extra one in this year because of the book release and all that's been going on. She has an extra one that she's doing in October on the 21st through the 24th. So we're excited about that. Normally they're just January and June. So this is your opportunity to get one in the fall and come and be with her. I'm sure Marshall is amazing in the fall, right, Claire? There's great food in Marshall, Michigan. So I love to go there, and a beautiful Airbnb that you can stay in. And it's just a wonderful time of kind of that solitude and place to really take in your own experience with that Enneagram Motions of the Soul training that Claire does. So check that out too. You can find that in our newsletter and in the website, and I'll post some of those links once we get into our conversation here in the chat as well. But I think that's all the announcements we have. Again, if you've just joined us and have a question or anything throughout the discussion, put that in the chat room, and we'll come around to those at the end of the call or throughout the call today. Claire will facilitate our conversation. So Claire, I'll turn it over to you and to Tom.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks for announcing this wonderful conference that's coming in July 2020, the IEA Regional Conference for the Great Lakes region and Minnesota. We're going to be collaborating for a time of celebrating the Enneagram as a verb. And just a shout out to Orion Tricky for coming up with that title. And she's down there with no video, but we would love to see you, Orion. Anyway, so thanks for joining us today. Tom Condon, if you're not familiar with Tom is the master Enneagram teacher, coach, author, and someone who has put together some of the great products that have helped us do the change we are intending on. And so the changeworks.com is where Tom does his work on the web, and we'll have that link for you there so that you can check it out and see all the things that Tom has available, from videos, audios, books, his interviews and podcasts. And if you've ever been with Tom, anybody want to just raise your hand if you've ever been with Tom at a workshop? Yeah, a couple of us here. And he really has a way of facilitating a dynamic experience. And so we're honored to have you here today, Tom. And why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you came to know the Enneagram in the work that you do as an NLP therapist and all of the other things that you do to help bring change into the lives of people.
Thanks for having me. I came across the Enneagram in 1980, and partially it was because I lived in Berkeley, where Helen and Claudio and a few other people were teaching, I think. I took one thing with Helen. She used to do 10-week courses, and I had a background in NLP already, NLP, as you may know, is neuro-linguistic programming, and there are two versions of NLP. One is kind of obnoxious and sociopathic and glib and shallow. And there's another version of it that is quite deep and extensive and focused on creating change and modeling methods of change, and then also understanding personal experience in terms of the senses. It's real grounded that way. And yet it has its limitations. It's sort of focused on changing patterns and behavior, working with them in a surfacey sort of way. It's like behaviorism comes out of that kind of meme or that kind of strain of thought in psychology. And after a couple of years of working with NLP, I kind of found its limitations. And right about that time, I found the Enneagram. And the Enneagram was just in the air, mostly. A lot of people that I knew were therapists or counselors, or we call them coaches now, but who, people who worked with helping other people grow and change. And the Enneagram supplied the depth and the kind of picture of the whole person that NLP lacked. And so it was sort of like giving the methods in NLP a context. And the context was understanding people from the inside out. Oh. That said, in those days, the focus with the Enneagram was entirely on what was wrong with you. The neurotic low-side expressions of your style, and how there were some horrifyingly accurate, incisive insight into that, but not a lot of solutions, not a lot of focus on growing and changing, outgrowing the low side of your Enneagram style, outgrowing being a prisoner of your own model. And since I had the background in NLP, it seemed to me like the Enneagram needed whatever you could throw at it, basically. Whatever methods you could apply. The only ones that existed at that point were, well, after you've learned these kind of horrifying insights about yourself, you really should start meditating. That was one thing. And the other thing is encompassed in a Bob Newhart satire that's on YouTube, where he plays a psychiatrist and a woman comes in and she's a nervous wreck and terrified and phobic, and says that she has this overriding fear every day of her life of being locked in a box. And Bob Newhart sits there, takes it in as the psychiatrist, and he says, "Now I have a recommendation for you. I hope you're ready to listen." And the woman says, "Oh yes, absolutely, anything." He says, "You're sure now?" She says, "Oh yes, just tell me, what is it?" Newhart says, "Okay, here's the recommendation. Stop it.
Right.
Stop it. What are you, nuts? Quit it. Quit it. Nobody's going to lock you in a box. Stop it." And that's how the thing goes on. And in the end, he gets so frustrated that he threatens to lock her in a box. But the stop it idea was also kind of prevalent. If you're a 1 and you're judgmental, stop it. If you're a 6 and you scare yourself, knock that stuff off. And that's, as we'll see, that has a certain utility, but it's not enough usually. A lot of times, if it's the only thing you do, then it's kind of like isometrics. You kind of make the polarity stronger, and in doing that, you don't get very far. You struggle, but you don't necessarily change much. So anyway, that was what I did with it. I sat with it for about 7 years. And I had notes, a pile of notes that people would purloin for me from trainings. And I used those, and I had a private practice in NLP as a NLP practitioner. And after 7 years or so, the books came out, and it became possible to teach it, and it started to get more widely known beyond just the borders of Berkeley. And at that point, I thought teaching a combination of methods of change and then the Enneagram itself, but teaching it from a sort of grounded perspective that focused in on direct experience rather than kind of dogma or abstractions was the best way to go. And in those days, I had that little part of the field to myself. I don't anymore, of course.
Yeah, well, you inspired other people to take that direction. And so I'm wondering too, I love what you said, the Enneagram was there and then people started to throw other things at it. And it really has become such a robust system. Yes. Based on the fact that individuals who have particular skill sets can add. I wonder, because having been in some of your training, I know that motivation is a big deal for you. And so, as an NLP practitioner, even watching you as you present, it really isn't just about methodology, it's motivation. So can you tell us a little bit about what role motivation has in with the work that you do in the Enneagram?
Well, motivation to change and grow usually comes in two forms. One is you want to stop being in pain. You want to quit suffering in a way that you've been suffering. And then the other form of it is you're going towards something. You're going towards a goal, or you're going towards expanding your awareness and having greater presence and having a more complete life. And either one of those can be utilized in if you're working with the Enneagram. The thing about the Enneagram that's a little bit funny is that people, at least half the time, misuse it, misunderstand it, or reframe it, or defang it in some way that takes them away from whatever they may be truly challenged by. And in doing that, then motivation comes into it. Why are you in it? A lot of people get involved with the Enneagram, but then don't do very much with it, or they're inspired by it, or they get lost in the system, or they bounce around between teachers, or there are different lenses now to look at the basic Enneagram. And in doing that, you get sort of away from what it might be telling you, which is, well, this is a lifetime homework assignment. This is a way in which you are caught in obsolete responses. This is a way in which you are over-defended in the present. And maybe you were well-defended in the past, but now it's 2019 and, this is having effects. It's sort of like the thing that saved you is now the thing that's getting in the way. And one of the ways I approach working with the Enneagram and the low side of it, the kind of compulsive expressions or the fixated expressions of someone's personality style, is to regard it as a defensive state, a defense against something that basically used to happen. It doesn't really happen so much now, but you can make it seem to happen. You can kind of attract certain people or organize your world and your experience in certain ways so that the necessity of defending yourself in a way that is consistent with your Enneagram style is still necessary somehow. But
can I stop you there, Tom? I love this word you use, defang the Enneagram. So what would you tell us about the Enneagram's fangs that we need to stay with?
Well, it's kind of like, bad motel lighting. It's good news and bad news. I travel around a lot and stay in a lot of hotels, and every once in a while looking in the mirror in the bathroom where maybe the lighting is like neon lighting. It can be kind of stark. And there is a stark implication to being caught up in your pattern. And then there's all the ways in which we recognize, if we're honest, and you have to bring honesty to the party, that I think. If we're really honest, then we're recognizing how we're limiting ourselves, how we're affecting other people, how we're getting results that are the opposite of what we intend, how we are, sort of stuck in a rut, stuck in a brain groove, and are perceiving, as Richard Rohr would say, only 1/9 of the truth, which means that there's worlds upon worlds of experience that we're missing.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't like the lighting in hotels either. And,
Yeah.
And yet there are things that you see when you're in that light that might alert you to needing a checkup of some kind, right? Oh, there's a spot there that might actually be a real problem. And so
actually, the lighting in stores when you're buying clothes are sometimes like that too. I can't figure out why.
I know, because I'm not buying anything when I see myself look like that in the mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but the Enneagram, when the fangs do their work, then it's giving us a way to see the ways we've wounded our own lives and the lives of other people. And I love this idea of 4 paths to change. And I think as a preacher, I would say that boy can that preach. Tell us about 4 paths to change.
Well, basically, this is in a workshop I'm doing in Chicago on the 28th and 29th. Basically, it's sort of a model of existing patterns of change or methods of change, what people do already in relation to their Enneagram style, and how to understand that maybe in a new way, and expand it or improve it, or have it become more effective. But also then I've got a bunch of methods that come out of my background that I haven't seen applied to the Enneagram very much, that are kind of powerful within themselves. And then when you add in the context, the deep context of the Enneagram, it really has an impact, and an impact that stays with people. But the 4 paths that, as I'm teaching it, are one of them is standing back, which is something that's recommended a lot in Enneagram practices. Meditation is part of it, but meditation where you become a witness to your own pattern, for example, and you stand back from it, you dissociate from it in a useful sort of way. It's also something that people arrive at naturally when they first learn the Enneagram, where they realize, oh, there's me and then there's my pattern, and you start to take, and then you recognize the patterns in the people in your life, and you start to take their behavior less personally. And then you start to take your own behavior less personally. And there are, details and levels to self-understanding. And like I said, there's these different lenses and models. And some of them really land for people, and some of them maybe not so much, or it depends on the individual. But the standing back part of it has to do with getting perspective, kind of recognizing that your patterns and roles are conditioned responses, and it's not exactly like there's a false self and a true self, but there is a conditioned self and a defensive self that is expressed through the low side of your Enneagram style. And one of the ways I work with that and add to it is to bring in some models from NLP and other places in my background that kind of open up. They work sort of like can openers. They kind of open up the fixed quality that people think about their Enneagram style with. And the motto for your upcoming conference kind of captures it, that it's a verb rather than a noun. If it's a noun, then it's a thing, and people aren't really things. And a verb means that it's part of a process. that rather than describing what you are, it's describing what you're doing. It's describing something more active, even if it's unconscious. And in the active unconscious replication of personality patterns, there are usually, the defensive elements that I talked about before, ways in which a person is trying to guard against something that used to happen. They're doing what used to work. And so starting to recognize those things, starting to recognize trigger points, starting to recognize when you have a typical reaction, a reaction that's typical for your style versus and catching yourself in the act. That's all part of it.
Well, and
that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And there is this word that I use, which is when you're on automatic, right? But there was a word you used in your last conference, and I know other people use it, but it was the first time I really heard it and received it as a wisdom word, which is when you're in the trance. And I thought, all I could think of was this very mindless way of living life, and so that word picture was really something for me, and I thank you for that.
When you're caught in your pattern, you're in a kind of open-eyed hypnotic trance, and it actually has qualities that are consistent with hypnotic trances. In other words, when people are in deep trances, some people can have amnesia, for example, for what happened within the trance. Other people can have hypermnesia, which is kind of detailed, vivid memories where you're back inside of an experience that you once had. Now, amnesia is something we talk about with 9s, and we might even further talk about it with 8s, 9s, and 1s, where you forget yourself. You kind of become invisible to yourself. You shift the focus off onto other people, or being strong, or being right, or any of those things. But there's a self in there somewhere who is overlooked. And then hypermnesia, you might think of 6s and 4s, sometimes 2s if they have a strong connection to 4, where there's a tendency to go back into the past and remember in an exceptionally vivid way. And it's a capacity of the unconscious, and something that hypnotherapists deliberately use, but then the rest of us may accidentally use it in the trance of our Enneagram style.
Wow. Well, you didn't name some of the other types and what kind of mnesia they might be in.
Well, mnesia is not the only thing. There's 15 or 20 hypnotic phenomena. But there's things like what they call positive hallucination, which is seeing things that aren't there. Using your imagination. We use positive hallucination to imagine where we want to go out to eat, for example. And in doing that, we conjure stuff up. And people do that in daily life. Somebody is maybe an engineer or an architect. They use positive hallucination to imagine the structure of a building or a bridge. But also 5s, 6s, and 7s all tend to positively hallucinate in this sense. They project their power and then kind of see it out in the world around them, and personified or exemplified or triggered by something in the outer environment. But actually it's their own true power. It's a kind of stand-in for their power. Wow. But they hallucinate. They see something that's not there. And so, reality checking, for example, becomes kind of important.
Sure.
There's other things like age regression and age progression, where a small child becomes a premature adult. That's age progression. And that's characteristic of 1s, occasionally a 5, a lot of times an 8 and a 3. They become premature adults. Put aside the things of childhood. But that's a hypnotic phenomenon that's well known to hypnotherapists.
Sure. and you can see it in the Enneagram styles.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about path number 2, going against.
So going against is partially what I was jokingly referring to as stop it, which is to say you try to interrupt your own pattern. You try to do something different once you're onto yourself. You try and do something different than the same old thing. And so it might take the form of a 4 who is sinking into a mood, realizing it, and they decide to go for a walk in the park or out in nature, something like that, where they interrupt the pattern. Or a 7 is given the assignment of throwing away 15% of their books, and they're sort of going against something that otherwise would be characteristic of the low side of their style.
Yeah, making room for people. Throw out some books, make room for some people.
For example, yeah. Things like that, where we usually in these workshops offer a number of homework assignments and kind of behavioral tasks that go with the different styles. And then the other part of going against is looping in and roping in and including and applying your strengths in relation to the low side of your Enneagram style. In other words, when you're caught up in your pattern, whatever your pattern is, you're not really accessing the high side, the capacities that you have when you're at your best, capacities that you have when you're feeling fine or things are going well. And there are methods for bringing those two things together and kind of bringing together the high side resources and combining them and applying them to the low side reactions. And doing that sometimes will sort of like the way you treat battery acid, with what do you call it? The Arm & Hammer baking soda. If you have battery acid on the battery in your car, you kind of wash it away with baking soda. It's a little like that, where the high side is then employed to influence the low side.
Nice. And then what about going with, path number 3?
Going with is going into the depth of a response. In other words, you have a reaction that you want to work on, and people usually with the Enneagram, there's things that they work on, at one point, and then they work on a different version of the same thing at another point, and all of it represents progress, and all of it represents a progression forward. But also, when you're reacting out of the low side of your Enneagram style, it would be sort of like asking yourself, well, what am I trying to do for myself? What are 3 good reasons to react this way? And then kind of sinking into the feeling of it and allowing yourself to go into the depth of it to find out how, in some ways, your personality defenses are mixed up attempts to take care of yourself, or that they are related to an attempt at creating well-being within yourself. And kind of using this approach pretty much eliminates things like spiritual bypass, because what you're acknowledging is that when you have low side reactions that you otherwise might be trying to meditate away, that those low side reactions have a kind of will and have a kind of intelligence and have a kind of urgency or a sense of necessity. And it winds up being very helpful to learn methods to go into that and to befriend your ego rather than to call it names. And
and I really appreciate you bringing in the term spiritual bypass. So as a pastor, as a spiritual director, many times I'm sitting with people who really have some psychological work to do, and they don't see that as congruent with their spirituality. So we're always trying to say that, all healthy spirituality includes healthy psychology, and all healthy psychology includes healthy spirituality. And so that spiritual bypass, when someone wants to just sacred text to confess it away with, passages of scripture, we would say this is a whole life work: mind, body, soul, strength, heart, you name it. It is all the work that needs to be done.
Yeah,
so spiritual bypass.
You're starting to tell them the kind of trouble that they're in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But also what it means, what the implications are, how this could be immensely beneficial rather than just sort of beneficial. Mm-hmm. And trying to meditate or pray something away is kind of a combination of that standing back that I was talking about, mm-hmm. and also going against, where you're trying to, kind of elide over the down and dirty details of your reactions and the human element within yourself, and you're trying to, sort of spiritualize your ego in a way.
There's that. Yeah. And, and I think about even your last path, going with, and, it gives us a way to say that there really are ways that will resonate with you more deeply, ways that will help you on the journey. And so there you have options. It's not necessarily going to be, because some people might really love that. Just stop it. And then you say, Eureka. Nobody's ever said just stop it before. And then you stop it. But I love this going beyond. Can you tell us about that, Tom?
Well, let me just add that with each of these approaches, each of these kind of distinctions, and they overlap a little bit too. If you only do one of them, you're likely to experience change as being really slow. In other words, if you only meditate and don't deal with your own biography and your sort of low-side expressions and your early struggles and defenses that were put in place because things were difficult or traumatic, or you were put into a family role that didn't really suit you or only emphasized one aspect of your character, or were, confused and confounded by the world around you. If you don't deal with those things or at least touch them, then just standing back is going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time to really stop having those reactions. And you don't really have to go into those reactions very deeply also. That's another sort of thing that people will sometimes dread when they approach changing and growing, which is, if a 7 will think, well, if I start to cry, I'll cry for a year, something like that. So it's better if I just stay out of my pain, and kind of keep skating along on the surface. But actually, it's more like salad dressing. If you came to a bottle of salad dressing and you didn't know what the ingredients were, you wouldn't drink the entire thing down. You'd taste it, run it around on your tongue, decide what you liked and disliked about it, identify the ingredients, and then you would go from there. And a lot of times, touching into shadows within our experience and ways in which we're polarized against certain aspects of our experience, like we over-identify with one side of our Enneagram style and under-identify with another. Over-identify with, I'm a 1, I over-identify with being good. I'm a 2, I over-identify with being helpful. And then those suggest their shadows. I'm a 1, I've got to be good, so I can't be bad, and other people are bad, but maybe I've got a little secret part that would love to be bad. And, if I'm a 2, I'm thinking only of others, but really I'm giving to others by metaphor, giving to myself. And there's a part of me that has needs, but I judge them as selfish, that kind of thing. And going near that and touching it and getting honest about it, a lot of times is really, really a good start, really very helpful. But you don't have to sink into it and, plunge into a hellish landscape.
Sure. And I think that is the fear sometimes. If I go there, I'll be re-traumatized. It was so traumatizing. Why would I do that again?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that there are methods for going there without being traumatized that are really, really quite helpful that way.
Yeah.
Some of which I'll be teaching in my workshop in September in Skokie, Illinois.
Yes, and so Tom is coming our way, Great Lakes people, and so before you give us path number 4, why don't you tell us about where you're going to be and what's going to happen there?
Well, it's going to be at the Doubletree in Skokie, and it will be some of the material that we're talking about here expanded, and there'll be direct experience, an emphasis on direct experience, and very useful methods of change. If you're a coach or a counselor or a therapist, it'll be pretty informative, I think. And then people will come for their own edification and their own work. And usually the feedback is that it was powerful, that it was led to meaningful changes. So that's all good. And it'll be at the Doubletree Inn on Skokie Boulevard in Skokie. It's where, if you've gone to some of Jerry Wagner's workshops, he's taught them there. Right across the street from a giant mall, plenty of restaurants, lots of facilities, and an interesting time will be had by all. I won't say a good time necessarily, but it'll be useful and helpful, and take you to your next step, take you past your next step. That's the idea.
Yeah. Well, what we've experienced, and I think Teresa would wave about this as well, is that your workshop when you were at Loyola was not only informative, but it was the experience of it was really an opening place. And so it was a place of opening. And so you have a masterful way of doing that kind of work, Tom. And so we're thrilled about it. We've got down on the chat bar just a short little intro to each of these pathways. I'm adding number 4, if you can talk about going beyond in these last few minutes.
Well, you just talked about it, actually. Opening is part of it. Opening to what's beyond your inner map of the world. In Christopher Columbus's time, the uneducated people anyway still thought the earth was flat. A lot of educated people knew better. But it's almost like we carry around within us a flat earth. And and actually I've discovered recently that there actually is a flat earth society still, and a very, very elaborate explanations for why the earth is flat. And they really believe it. But that's also a good way to think about your map of reality and your Enneagram map. It's kind of based on everything that you've already experienced, but not necessarily what you haven't experienced. And going beyond old pictures of yourself, old self-images, old pictures of the world, because we all carry within the flat earth, we have a sort of subjective universe that we go into when we're caught in the pattern of our Enneagram style, in the purview of our Enneagram style. And going beyond that, opening up in the way that you were talking about, there are a number of methods for doing that, and that also are quite powerful, or that lead to broader horizons or a more accurate picture of your present life, and leading to a more complete life. Also, modeling other Enneagram styles is something that's really very helpful. And what that means is that there are methods for, and I think people do this already in some workshops, some practitioners do, when they have those Enneagram bedspreads, that they throw on the floor, and they have people stand in different positions. That kind of is related anyway. But modeling means stepping into the shoes of and the direct internal experience of an Enneagram style that you admire, that has resources or capacities that you don't think you have, but you notice them. And the fact that you notice them and admire them means that they're somewhere nascent within you. Also, modeling even the high side of a shadow style. You know, people will learn about the Enneagram, and as if it matters, they'll decide which Enneagram styles they like and dislike. But usually when they're talking that way, they're confessing their character. They're talking about what's integrated and not integrated within their experience. So a 6 says, you know, I don't like 8s, or you know, but everyone loves 9s. They're still talking about themselves. You know, it's a confession of character rather than an objective statement about something that has to do with the Enneagram. And when you recognize certain shadow styles that way, you know, either white shadows or dark shadows, positive shadows or negative shadows, one thing that really helps is to be able to step into the shoes of any of those shadows and to experience them from the inside out. And usually if a 6 says, well, I don't like 8s, they're not talking about 8s, every 8. They're talking about unhealthy 8s. They're talking about the low side. And so they're leaving out the high side. And the high side is, has a lot of capacities that especially help 6s, you know, like being honest and forthright and bold and direct and courageous, you know, taking action, that sort of thing. So modeling those things, there are some really cool methods for doing that we'll be exploring in the workshop in Skokie, September 28th and 29th. I'm sorry, it's a kind of Tourette's. Now I can't hear you, Claire. You've gone quiet.
I've gone quiet. Here I am.
There. Okay.
Now I can hear you.
Our car is overheating in the desert over here, so now Scott is driving around the rest area just so that the bun coolers will turn on and the car won't overheat.
Okay. All right.
Okay. And so so Teresa's got the date there. She's got the web address where you can register. And right here in the Great Lakes region. And I think one of the things that I'd love to close out with today, so grateful for the work that you've been doing all these years, since the time you learned it in 1980 and the time you started teaching it in 1987. So you sat with it for 7 years, which is something I wouldn't understand because I'm a 3. I had to start teaching it before I knew what the heck I was talking about. Mm-hmm. And verbally process all of my errors in public. It was awesome. And so, but I love this Greek word found in some sacred text. There is a word that we use, it's healing. And the word is therapeuo when it's translated, therapeuo. And it's where we get our word for therapy. And so all healthy psychology and all healthy spirituality and all healthy physicality has this idea of an ongoing work of transformation, an ongoing therapeutic work. And so what I love is if we're going to be willing to heal, we're going to have to do this lifelong assignment. That, you know, I love that. Teresa quoted you in the chat bar there. It's a lifelong homework assignment. And the grace of it is when you're in a community of knowers, KNOWERS, we do offer one another the kind of grace to be with both the fangs and, you know, and what we might say is the beauty part of our Enneagram style. And I did ask if there were any questions, but I think you taught so well that nobody had anything but thanks. I see Ruthie is giving you a big thanks there, and we really appreciate you making time to be with us, Tom.
You can you'll find on my website there's a discount for IEA members too.
I was going to mention that, Tom, because we always want to support the IEA in that way, and we appreciate you giving that discount for that. Patricia asked too, do you have a book yet on this topic of these things, Tom?
I have 2/3 of a book.
Okay.
which is for sale online at my website. It's called the Dynamic Enneagram.
Okay.
And there's a lot of material, but there's a few chapters that are still missing. I'm just publishing it chapter by chapter.
Well, thank you. And so make sure you check out Tom's website, and you can find out, someone ask about the price and all those types of things. But Chicago's a very easy city to get to, fly into, drive to for us in the Midwest region. So thank you for that and for sharing with us.
Yeah, and Teresa, great VRBOs. We've 6 of us have stayed in one VRBO. In fact, I think the last time when Tom and Russ were here, we, so there are inexpensive ways to continue learning.
Yes.
Absolutely. So
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.